Well, if it's a couple of minutes after the hour here, I think we'll get started. We have a few people here, and hopefully some other people join us as we move through our session today. This is, of course, the second session of 4 that the City of Stratford is hosting for the people who live in Stratford. Anybody else, particularly who's interested. Last session, I'll just go through it very briefly. In a moment, was dealing with what cities can and can't do in Ontario. Today, we're talking about role clarity of the various people who work for the city and represent the city in various types of capacity. So with that in mind, our very first thing we'd like to do, or I'd like to do, is actually turn this over to Mayor Dan Matheson to at least provide a few comments in terms of what this is intended to do, and just some words of welcome from the city. Mayor Dan, if you're available.
Thanks very much, Ian. I want to thank everyone for coming. As Ian said, this is the second session, and tonight is role clarity as it relates to what we can and can't do, and what municipal government can do for you as a citizen, and how you can be engaged. We're hoping through this process that all residents will find some information helpful to them. I want to assure you that Council is also going through a series of these workshops with Ian as well, so that we all understand our roles as well better. And this is one of these things that we've learned about through Ian's expertise across the country through his book, Who's Driving the Grader? And for anyone that would like a light read on government, but also a good primer, that would be a great book to start with. Many members of council will be on and off tonight's sessions. Some will be here for the whole time. I do know some had a meeting earlier that is running a little late and they will be joining. So please, as we work through this, we hope that you enjoy it. Our clerk is recording this along with Ian, and this will be put onto the city's website and will be used as an opportunity for us to continue to gain information, share information. And if there is opportunity for further sessions, we will continue to gauge that with Ian's expertise and guidance and feedback we receive from these sessions themselves. Ian, I want to thank you for making the time. I know earlier in this week, I happened to see that you were going to be BC, Alberta, Manitoba, Ontario, and I think you were down in Australia or something, or speaking to people in Australia this week. So I know that your time is very valuable, and we appreciate you making the opportunity to join us and, of course, engage with us as council members, city staff, but also with our residents. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mayor Matheson. So we will move on to just a quick note here too on kind of what's up. And you'll see in this little call out here that if you have something that you would like to say, or anything, questions that you would like to ask, there are a couple of ways that you can do that. The first is to put information in the chat here in Zoom, and the second is to raise your hand. I'm on a fairly small screen, as the mayor referenced. I'm actually in BC at the moment. I'm working with the city of Prince George, doing a strategic plan with them. Next week, we're in the city of Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, doing something very similar as well. So we do tend to get around. But this session is really important, and in fact, we worked the session here in BC around this session because I wanted to make sure we made time for the citizens and others in Stratford. So this is a 4-part series, as the mayor referenced. The first one is on the city's website right now. The recording of the session that we had done a couple of weeks ago, it's a 2-hour session, along with the handout or slides for that session are available as well. As the slides for the session, I believe, are on the city's website too. And once the session is done, it too will be posted to the city's website probably in the next couple of days. The overall idea behind this session is to provide citizens and organizations and businesses, basically people in Stratford and other places who may be interested, and just getting a bit of an overview on the role of local government in their lives. Of course, we've just gone through the federal election across the country. Some parts of the country are embarking on provincial elections, and municipal elections momentarily too. For example, the province of Alberta is going to their polls municipally next Monday. So they had a bit of a conflation of two different elections happening at the same time, which probably made for some quite interesting campaigning. So the first session we did was just on what cities can and can't do specifically in Ontario. Today's session is talking about roles, so role clarity, and we're going to deal specifically with start at the top and work down. So we will deal specifically with the role of council as a whole. We will speak to the role of the individual member of council. Then we will speak to the role of the mayor, who is a member of council but has some additional duties as well. And then we'll speak to council's only employee, which is the city manager or chief administrative officer. and deal a little bit with municipal administration as part of that. The next session, which actually comes up, I think, a week from now, is on engagement in local government. So we'll speak to the concepts of communication, which is telling people within Stratford and environs what's going on, to engagement, all the way across the continuum to engagement, talking about how we involve people in the business of local government, recognizing that the council remains the final decision maker. So anything that a decision that has to be made by council, can't be made specifically by citizens, with very few exceptions. The last session we'll have 2 weeks later than that is on municipal finance. And specifically, we will speak to where money comes from and where it goes, kind of in the big buckets, if you like, about how municipal finance works. So those are the sessions that we are doing. The mayor referenced that we are doing some concurrent sessions with city council as well. Their schedule is a little bit more drawn out. We're working with them kind of once a month over the next few months, as opposed to yourselves who are working with every couple of weeks. Just some things to make our time together work well. We have chosen to use Zoom as a platform that people are quite familiar and generally comfortable with. We've chosen to use just general Zoom meetings rather than Zoom webinar. Zoom meetings allow you to see each other, to see us, and to allow us to interact quite freely back and forth. Zoom webinar is basically just watching a presentation. You don't see other people. But we thought it was useful to be able to hear and see, and people to engage with me and with other people who might be on the Zoom as well. So as part of that, however, because there are a significant number of us on this one call, is recognizing that this was that the ideal would be sitting in a room face to face, of course, but that just isn't practical at the moment. So this is kind of the best of plan B. And I typically tell groups that I'm working with that because that's the case, it just requires a little bit of extra grace and a little bit extra patience. Actually, our first session worked very well that way. We got some really good questions coming in through the chat. A couple of people asked them just live. And in fact, a few people emailed me after the session too, and that's always available. I will provide my contact information as the very last slide here. And it will also therefore be on the city's website as well. We are looking for different opinions as well. There are some things which are just factual because they come right out of legislation. Then there are things which become principle-based or culture-based, about which we can have some discussion if you like, because there are some different ways that we can go. If, however, there are comments that are shared, either verbally or in the chat, that are inappropriate, I will most likely ask you to refrain from doing that. If you do, that's fine, we'll continue on. If not, we do have the ability to remove people from this Zoom call. Wasn't a problem last week. I don't expect it to be a problem this week. And the final note here again is just that we will put the session on the city's website for anybody to see if they want. I will make a note too in terms of the questions that you ask. One of the things about this type of a session being done live is you can ask any question you want. I will try and answer to the best of my ability, recognizing I don't live in Ontario, but I will certainly do my best to do that. And the feedback we got after last time was that actually seemed to work pretty well. So if you've got questions, whether they are about the legislation or whether they are about things like principle and culture, please go ahead and ask, and we'll see if we can deal with them. So specific to this session here, recognizing that, as the mayor said, this is the field I work in daily across the country, and it's kind of neat to be able to work with you on a more concerted basis over the next little while as well. I would like this to be you interacting with me and potentially with others here. There are city staff, there are city council members on the Zoom as well, and it's a good opportunity to interact. So you, as much as I don't want to talk to you straight for 2 hours, you probably don't want to listen to me for 2 hours either. So please do add your thoughts where you think that they add value or where you've got some genuine questions or just curious about things. We often use terms like good governance or great governance. And while these are written, there's often some variability to them, if you like. And really what I think about is I think about the pinnacle of great governance. What does the best operating municipality in this country look like? In an ideal state, in an ideal world, recognizing that nobody's there yet. So how do we actually get there? And this piece talks about there are lots of routes up that mountain. So while I may speak about a particular course of action or suggestion, there are probably some other ways to do the exact same thing. So just a comment to that effect. Know something that because you're involved in this call, you have committed some of your time. It tells me that you're interested in your community as well. So kudos to you. You don't want everybody in Stratford to be exactly the same person. You don't want council to be 9 members of exactly the same person either. So bring what you can. We all bring our personal aptitudes, we bring our history, we bring our values and principles as well. To me, those are the best teams that we've got. So the recognition of this is that you want everybody to be successful. People move to Stratford for a reason. They they stay there for a reason. What is it? And kind of what's the magic sauce, if you will, about what's going on with Stratford? If we want to have an argument today, which is fine, be interested in that debate, of course. If you disagree with the things that I'm saying or the interpretations that I've made, write it down and let me know, whether it's in the session here today or whether you want to follow up after the fact, like a couple of people did after the session. That works for me as well. Somebody has just asked in the chat if we can have a 2-minute break halfway through. We'll try and remember that. So Mark, if you remind me halfway through, about an hour in, what's the time now? Now we're a quarter after. If you remind me about halfway through, Mark, I'll see if we can do that. Just a bit about myself, for those of you who weren't here last week, I run a company called Strategic Steps. We have offices in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and this is our bread and butter in terms of the industry we work in. It's local government. Most of the time in Canada, though Mayor Matheson did make a reference to Australia, I'm actually working in Australia at the moment virtually anyway, on a couple of panels, expert panels for one of their local government administrations, which is all what sounds really interesting until you realize the panels don't start till 11:30 p.m. and they go till 1 a.m. So that's not the best timing, but whatever. What we do is follow the election cycle. So we do candidate orientations, we do councillor orientations after elections. I mentioned I'm in BC. We're doing a strategic planning session for the city of Prince George, or with council and senior management right now. Into Saskatchewan next week, doing exactly the same thing. And sometimes if a municipality wants a health check or something's not going well, we work with them as well on things like an audit or a full-on review of their governance or of the entire organization, trying to make sure that the right people are in the right place, doing the right thing. I write a column for for Municipal Voice in Saskatchewan, for the Saskatchewan Urban Municipalities Association. The mayor referenced my book, Who's Driving the Grader, and Other Governance Questions, which came out last year. My new book is coming out, will be The Aptitudes of the Best Mayors. This one's being called The DNA of Great Leaders, and there's a subtitle to that too. So that's just a little bit about my background. So this is the next book I'm coming out with in terms of the book, the next book on the mayors. It's about what makes good mayors or the best mayors, and I've seen this filter into 3 different buckets, if you like. One is something that mayors, and I mentioned mayors, but these could be like board chairs as well, if you're part of a not-for-profit organization or even a company, that they bring their inherent skills and aptitudes that they had before they got engaged in whatever they're currently engaged in. A couple of examples there. They bring their community leadership. The best mayors, for the most part, are people who have metaphorically grown up in the community, that they have seen the value in what they do as a volunteer and have chosen to extend that service to a different order of work or a different intensity of busyness. And the third piece is something that people can learn, and that's the skill on how to be a good governor. So knowing, we talk about lanes sometimes, and we'll talk about that a little later today, about people staying in their lanes. So the elected officials stay in the lane of governance, managers stay in the lane of management and administration and service delivery. So the best mayors really know how well that works. Knowing that there is an opportunity for collaboration, that different people bring different skills. So really that's what I've seen in terms of the governance skills that are present. So all 3 of these together make a pretty good mayor. I just wanted to open it up before we get too far into this. Oops, sorry. From last session, I wanted to see if any of you here on this call today had any questions that you wondered about from last time, either things that you may have asked me about, or things that you were curious about or thought about over the last couple of weeks. Is there anybody there? And so this is the topics that we had talked about last time, was what cities can and can't do. So we talked at the top, we talked about legislation from the Constitution on down. We talked about planning, strategic planning and business planning and that kind of things. We spoke about the levers that council has, the fact they only really have these 3, the bylaw, they can change bylaws, they can change policies, or they can change the budget. That's really all that council can do, with a few nuanced differences. We did a bit of an overview of citizen involvement, so that engagement and communications piece. And finally, we talked a little bit about budgeting, those last 2 being full-fledged sessions in their own right. So we dealt with them just as a tiny bit. So before I move on, Was there anything that you had, any questions that you had coming out of last time that you wanted to ask this time before we move on? Please, if you do, just unmute yourself and ask, or raise your hand, or just write something in the chat. I don't see a ton of stuff coming. Oh, Ken raised his hand. Go ahead, Ken.
Hello. Well, one of the things I'm wondering, and I saw the first session,
Okay.
council's levers. When you talk policy, would that be in the ballpark of a city passing or supporting a larger issue, like another city comes up with an innovative idea, wants to implement it, but perhaps it's not in current legislation or the municipal act, and another city council might vote in support of that and send a letter. So kind of on the topic of a city being able to be an influencer at the provincial level.
Yeah, that's pretty common. It's most likely not going, it probably wouldn't be a bylaw or a policy though, Ken. It would probably end up being just a resolution of council to say so-and-so municipality has asked us for a letter of support to the minister of such and such about a project. Do we want to send one or not? And then that just becomes a simple vote of council, and the motion may read to have administration write a letter, have the mayor sign it, and to refer it on to the other municipality. That in fact happens quite a lot, particularly on regional issues where there's a request for regional support, and it looks like, or they think the perception will be that if you get a dozen municipalities or 50 municipalities in support of something that a different municipality is doing, that the provincial government or the federal government is more likely to look favorably upon it. It could go the other way as well, and say the city of Stratford wants to do something and wants support from another series of municipalities. They can do that. They could also run through the Ontario Municipal Association or the Federation of Canadian Municipalities for that too. When it comes to, sorry, Ken, does that answer your question?
A little bit. Just one follow-up to
Sure.
that. I'm wondering if there's any impetus that a city could do that would increase their influence or their request for upper levels of government to perhaps take a different program and adjust it or delete it or initiate it. And would it be appropriate for a city to ask for either a referendum of its citizens to show greater support, or even a petition of its citizens? Can council do that kind of thing?
Well, it certainly can control those, well, not the petition necessarily. It could control a plebiscite or a referendum and ask that they be put to a ballot, either in conjunction with a municipal election, say, or in some other way. That's not frequently done, however. Sometimes the municipality, though, will ask for letters of support from non-government entities, chambers of commerce, social organizations, community groups, professional associations, that will make it look like the request is actually is coming from a broad base, not just a political base. The same thing then could also be done by neighboring municipalities using the principle that a rising tide floats all boats. Okay. Going to referendum or plebiscite is a more difficult issue because one of them is binding and one of them is not, and it's pretty expensive and can take a lot of time.
Okay, thank you.
Does that help?
It does.
Okay, thanks. Was there anything else from last time? All right, well, if you think of it, let me know. So for this session, we are going to look at the roles, and I made a reference to the roles we're actually going to look at, from council, councillor, mayor, CAO, and administration. As we work through this, think to yourself about whether you have any questions about this, whether the roles are clear to you, whether you have any questions about kind of who does what or who takes primary ownership of what, and whether there are specific things that you want to see us cover. So I've worked specifically around role clarity here, but if there are things that are kind of related to role clarity that you want to talk about here today, I'm more than happy to entertain comments or questions to that effect as well. And there are folks from the city listening in too, so they're of course probably taking some notes, or at least going to listen to the recording as well to get an idea of what people are thinking. So with that in mind, is there anybody on the call who wants to make sure that I deal with something specifically associated with the roles in each part of the city government? Okay, well, what we'll do then is, much like we had done last time, for those of you who are here, we'll proceed, and at each kind of section break, I'll take a bit of a stop, we'll do a bit of a check-in, and just see that see, make sure we're covering what you want to cover, because as the mayor mentioned, this is time that the city saw fit to invest in the citizens so that they will understand how cities work as well. So if we look specifically at role clarity, we are looking at these 5 roles, if you like, of how local government works. We're going to talk specifically about each one. The image that you see on the right is something called a procedure bylaw or a meeting procedure bylaw. Every municipality has one of these, and it is unique to every municipality, although you'll see a lot of them are fairly similar to one another. The federal government really doesn't speak much to municipalities, other than to say that they are the responsibility of the provinces and the territories. From there, the provinces and territories do what they like with municipalities to, in terms of creating them, in terms of modifying them, in terms of dissolving them, any of those sorts of things. And they set the high order rules for municipalities. Then if you look at the next level down, that's where we're going to start today. So each municipality will have things like this procedure bylaw. And what the procedure bylaw will do is set out some descriptor of role that goes beyond what's in provincial legislation. It will also do things like state whether, for example, the mayor sits on committees and whether or not the mayor votes on committees. It will talk about oftentimes the order of business for meetings. It will talk about start and end times potentially. It will speak to sometimes things like codes of conduct, codes of ethics, though more often than not, those are in separate bylaws and policies too. And because this is a bylaw rather than a policy, it is the highest order of statute or limit or legislation, if you like, or document that a municipality can have. And so within there, it constitutes council. Typically, provincial municipal acts will say what council numbers are. And council numbers are like often around 7 as a median. Some will go lower than that, and some will choose to go higher than that. The number is usually left up to the municipality. Of course, a larger municipality will often have more councillors than a smaller municipality will, but that number can also change based on changes to the bylaw that the municipality has the opportunity to make. So that's for some of the big things. So other pieces that show up in here are meaning in the procedure bylaw, are how to run meetings, how to make motions, when motions pass and fail, things like whether motions are to be recorded or not just by default. And typically by default, motions are not recorded to an individual's name. They are recorded as carried or defeated, but that's all. You can request, an elected official can request what's called a recorded vote, which would mean that the people who voted yay and the people who voted nay on a particular vote would have their names listed beside whether they voted yes or no. Sometimes this is a matter of course, and sometimes it's a bit of a political tactic to get people to stand by the votes that they're actually making. Anyway, so this is the bylaw. The policy itself, however, will add a little bit more flesh to this as well. So there will be governance policies, which is what council passes, modifies, and rescinds, and typically just deals with themselves and the chief administrative officer or the city manager. Then there will be a whole bunch of administrative policy as well. And these will be under the control of the city manager and other managers within the municipal structure. And these things will deal with more administrative things and really won't have an impact on council or be decided by council. So if we are to start with council, when we think about how council operates and what it's supposed to do, these are the 2 pieces that it really has to do. It has to focus on governance rather than operations. And this is often one of the most difficult things for new members of council to understand. So what that means in practical sense is that a member of council is more interested in the policy decision than they are in the specific day-to-day activity. An example of this would be pothole repair. So an individual member of council ought not to be choosing which potholes get fixed and when. So that becomes like an output, how much, how many, how often. What the individual member of council and the rest of their colleagues ought to be interested in is things like road maintenance or infrastructure repair or asset management, and then passing a bylaw or a policy associated with that, which then begets a budget line as well. And out of that budget line, there is a segment that deals with potholes, and then the potholes get filled based on work orders. So there's a differentiation there between what council ought to be doing and what council, what actually happens literally on the street or in the street. So council's at the higher order is following from those governance matters, and operation management and administration are following on operational matters. However, council members are members of the community. So those of you who live in Stratford may be contacting your councillor to complain about a noisy dog next door. It's not the councillor who's going to be visiting the neighbor. It's going to be probably a bylaw officer or someone like that. What that means is, even though it's an operational matter, it tends to go to council, the individual member of council, based on a relationship rather than based on role. And at that point, the member of council most likely is contacting the city manager to say, hey, this is a problem, can you deal with it? And then the city manager, of course, will contact bylaw services and we'll get it dealt with that way. So the council's focus is on on outcomes. So the results of what actually has to be done to make the city the best it can be. If council is too much in the weeds, if you like, they have become inefficient and a lot of exceptions get made, and they would spend 24 hours a day, 7 days a week doing their job, and they still would never get it done. So they need to focus, and that can often be, for a new councillor in particular, it can be one of the toughest things they have to do. So you'll notice that the title of this slide potentially is about boards, and it speaks specifically to the difference between working boards and governance boards, or policy boards are sometimes called governance boards. So if we were to look at those when members of the community are doing their volunteer work and eventually decide to run for office, they're often switching the focus from a working board to a governance or policy board. But the names are often the same. So just when we do orientations for new city councils, this is a big thing that we talk about, because we need those people who are used to selling chocolate covered almonds to back off and start setting policy on when those almonds get sold. So if I was to look at this, look at the difference between a governance board and a working board, I've got these four aspects, if you like. And so for a governance board, council, for governance board, you can say city council here if you want to. The primary focus of a governance board is to set long-term direction for the municipality. And they do that through things like creating a vision, what success looks like for Stratford a generation from now, or mission about how we're going to get from here to there, or creating policy that people can implement. If you look at it, the primary focus on a working board is to do stuff. So if you're part of a figure skating club or Scouts Canada or a fundraising or a charity, you're probably doing things. You're selling those chocolate covered almonds. You're out selling raffle tickets. You are volunteering in your community to make it better. And so the board itself is managing. So it is in the weeds by necessity. And that's why it's a working board, because the board members do the work. If we're to look now at the leadership of that governance board, so if we look at the organization as a whole, so to say that the whole city of Stratford, the board is city council, and they are the ones who need to set direction. So they are the ones who create the vision and mission. They're the ones who create the strategic plan. They're the ones who review bylaws and policies. They then hand off to administration to carry out the will of council. If you look at the leadership of a working board, often that's led by the staff. So the staff will say they need something doing. They look at the board as a group of volunteers, or maybe they're paid. They look at the board as a group of people who can go out and help deliver something in the community, not something that a council would typically do. When we look at the planning aspects of a governance board, the council needs to lead that. I mentioned I'm working at the moment in Prince George, BC, and I'm working today and tomorrow with council and senior administration on a new strategic plan for the city. They're a city of about 90,000 people, and they're looking at what success looked like for Prince George like a generation out from now. So the mayor and council and senior managers are getting together, but the strategic plan is owned by council. It will be approved by council, and it will be provided to staff to carry out. My conversation to the city council today was about, you can't be everything to everybody. What is it that makes Prince George unique? And I would say the same thing about Stratford. What is it that makes Stratford unique? And so that's the sort of thing that ought to be in Stratford's strategic plan. And I know here in BC, when I think of Stratford, I do think of arts. To me, it's kind of the arts capital of Canada. I suspect you've probably cultivated that. If we look at planning from a working board perspective, where the board members are out there actually doing the stuff, oftentimes it's the staff who are the drivers of that. They're the ones who will come to the board and say, here is our plan for the next year or the next 3 years or the next 5 years. What do you think? And they'll ask for the board to endorse it rather than create it, because the board is the one who's going to have to do the work. And then when it comes to recruitment, so replacement of the board, in a governance board, the board only has a single employee, and that is the city manager. So the only person the board can replace is the city manager. The board can't even replace itself because it goes to the election, to an election, and members of the community essentially choose the board. And we're going to talk about that dynamic a little bit later. However, when we're looking at a working board, the board members are often asked to recruit themselves. If you tried to leave that curling board or that figure skating board, they'll probably say to you, hey, do you know somebody else who has good financial knowledge who you think might be able to replace you? Can't do that with a council, of course. So the point of spending a bit of time on here and the key differences between governance board and working boards is just to know that though the nomenclature, the words may be the same, the actual expression of how the work is carried out is significantly different between the two. When I think about councils themselves and new members coming into a council, one of the really interesting things to me is that the members of council, whether it's a 3-person council or whether it's a 13-person council, those people didn't choose their colleagues. The members of the community chose them to work together. I call it each other's first team. So the members of council didn't choose each other, but they do get to sit together beside each other for the next 4 years. They may like each other, hopefully they do. They may not like each other, that's a bit of a problem, but they've got to work together. So the electors brought these people together to complete the work of the community. And one of the pieces to this that I think is really kind of interesting is that this first team knows more about their community than anybody else does or should. And the reason that is because as they're brought together, they're dealing with confidential matters that are of benefit to the community or potentially of detriment to the community as well. And they're having to work their way through this just amongst themselves, potentially with the city manager and potentially with a couple of 3 other people who may be present as well as determined by council. So they have all this information that the community does not. And what this sometimes means is it looks like council is doing things that they ought not to be doing, or council is not being transparent. And sometimes there are reasons for that. I mean, the obvious ones are things like a review of the city manager's contract, an annual performance review. Even in the private industry, I don't do my reviews of the folks who work with me in public, and I wouldn't consider that to be appropriate in a public setting in a city council either. Other things, the metaphor for this is often things like land, labor, and legal. Anything that has to do with land, so purchases of land, sometimes the implication of zoning or annexations, those sort of things, would be discussed in camera, but any decisions that have to be made, for example, to buy or sell a piece of land, would still have to be done in open session. When it comes to labor, so we've dealt with land and labor, so collective bargaining agreements are things that would be done in camera, and the council would know about more so than other members of the community. Of course, the contract with the union local would have to be ratified and signed in public and endorsed in public by a motion too. And then there's legal. So this is sometimes things like legal advice that's being provided to the community on an issue, or if the community is named in a suit or is actually suing another entity. Those are the sorts of things that would happen in camera, which members of the city council know about and other members of the community ought not to know about until such time as it becomes public. And this includes knowledge that the city council members may be passing on to their spouses, but ought not to be doing. One of the first places we look for municipalities that don't work properly is if things are being discussed in public that ought not to be discussed in public. This could be that metaphorical brown envelope that slipped under somebody's door. This could be somebody just mentioning something to a neighbor. It could be speaking too loudly in the coffee shop. All of those sort of things can break this confidentiality, and it's really can be a problem. So council is privy to this information and has to keep it privy. Has to keep it private. They do, however, have to focus on civic business too. The city council is elected to look after the business of the city because the people who live there don't have time to do it for themselves. So the civic business may be everything from filling those potholes that I talked about, putting on recreation programs, or perhaps dealing with noxious weeds. Not something you and your neighbors necessarily want to deal with, but still has to be dealt with. And that falls to city council. And in turn, city council then hires other people to help them out with that. I recognize too that on a council of between 3 and 13, you don't want all the same people. My common saying is everybody gets along all the time on city council and agrees on everything. Only one of you actually needs to be there. And that's not the case. So in this way, diversity is power. I like to look at a city council and see represented on that council the depth and breadth of the community. I like to see young people. I like to see old people. I like to see people who've just moved to the city and people who've been there for generations. I like to see accountants. I'd like to see moms. This is kind of the diversity you want to have in representative democracy, the diversity that brings benefit to the community. So this is how council kind of works together or is brought together, but they need to stay together as well through the course of their 4-year term. And here are some ideas of ways that council does that. So most, if not all, municipalities, particularly large ones, will have a budget and for council's professional development. And some of that will be things like going to conferences. I mentioned the provincial or federal municipalities conferences. Some of it may be individual courses of study that they're interested in, diversity and inclusion, for example. Maybe there's a program that they want to take. It may be bringing in a professional to speak to them about a little while. I'm an example of that at the moment, working with City Council on principles of good governance. And sometimes it's things like team building. So if City Council is off to do a strategic planning retreat someplace, just actually spending time in the same physical location as one another, getting to know each other as human beings, getting to interact with each other, learning about each other's families, helps them understand some of the motivation about why things are the way they are in the community. So that's just a little bit about how a council can come together. When I think specifically about the role of council once they have been brought together, this is some of the things that I would think about. Something I find, particularly in municipalities where there are wards or divisions, where different members of council represent geographically different parts of the city, so typically pretty large cities in this case, there sometimes comes a bit of a conflict, not necessarily a conflict, but a lack of awareness about who am I actually elected to represent. And if you were to read the Municipal Act, or if you were to read an oath of office, they would probably all say you're there to look after the interests of the entire city, which, if everybody's elected to represent the entire city, isn't such a big deal, but can be in municipalities where there are wards, where there's a bit of push and shove or back and forth between who gets what in their particular area. Because there's only $1 to spend. If we spend 90 cents in your area, we can only spend 10 cents in mine. However, it may be more beneficial that I recognize that something needs to go into your area or a particular part of the city. Councillors also need to avoid conflicts of interest. We talked a little bit about that last week. And in this case, I've used the term pecuniary interest. And pecuniary interest is a conflict of interest that is financial in nature. So somebody benefits from something that's going on. In this case, however, I often use the example of a council member who owns a piece of land that they want to subdivide. Of course, they're going to benefit from that personally, so they would not be able to be involved in the decision of council to either approve or turn down that request for subdivision. Now, the council member is still a citizen, so still retains the rights of citizenship, but ought not to be can't participate in that debate. Council members also have to attend council meetings and committee meetings. It's kind of table stakes, but in many cases, that's the highlight of what they're being asked to do legally by statute. And so as long as they attend council meetings and committee meetings, they're usually okay. Now, by the letter of the law, they're okay. By the spirit of the law, they seem to have missed the boat a little bit. Most people don't get elected just to attend meetings. As a note here too about informal council meetings, anytime more than half of council is gathered together and discusses municipal business, it's considered a council meeting, even if no decisions are made. And in statute, the procedure bylaw I mentioned, there is probably a notice period that says council has to give 48 hours notice of a meeting being convened. I made the number up, but it would be in the procedure bylaw. If council gets together without no public notice of a meeting, there can be trouble that happens from that, and it becomes a contravention of whatever the bylaw happens to be. So if council members are getting together for a Christmas party, that's fine, as long as they don't talk about municipal business. But if they get together and they talk about zoning applications at the Christmas party, it becomes a council meeting, not duly called, and we've got a problem. I also find that I'm in BC at the moment doing this strategic planning. One of the first questions I asked this morning as we started the strategic planning session with council, all of council there was, is this a council meeting? And oftentimes, and I think this is the case in Stratford too, the procedure bylaw says that there is an exception that's made for strategic planning specifically, where we can get all members of council together and members of administration to have a conversation about a strategic plan. However, it doesn't mean until the plan is approved by council in open session, the plan doesn't take effect. So it's a workshop, but there are no decisions being made. Other things that council has to do are representing the community. To me, this is one of the big pieces for council, that they are there for speeches at high school graduations. They are there to bring greetings for a visiting delegation. They are there on Remembrance Day to lay a wreath as well. So they're representing the community and what they do. We made a reference a little while ago to professional development and some of the aspects of that they can deal with, or they ought to be doing. And those of you who were here last time may recall me talking a bit about the avoidance of focus on a specific issue. If somebody, if somebody runs for council and all they're worried about is that pothole problem, and they get their pothole dealt with in 6 months, now what do you do for the next 3.5 years while you're on council? You end up with a bit of a rogue or a renegade council member, and they have to find something to do, and sometimes idle hands do the devil's work. And that's a bit of an extreme, I suppose, but they may be looking for something to do. So avoiding that focus on the single issue. It's even more problematic if that single issue is actually not something that is under the local government's authority. Example of that would be somebody who is running for council saying the only thing I want to do is institute term limits so I can get some of the old guard out of here. You can't. You would find a constitutional challenge in Canada to term limits. So it's not something you could just do by bylaw. So there was a question that came in here. I'm just going to quickly reference it, even before we get to the end of the section. See if I can read it here. Question about the representation on a council. Does the Municipal Act preclude or discourage a councillor in open session supporting an identified group, such as marginalized people with mental health issues or low income or seniors, for example? Not knowing the Municipal Act, but knowing a lot of other municipal legislation, Ken, my suggestion would be, and people can correct me if I'm wrong, that no, there's nothing in the act that would preclude that from happening, with the exception of if there becomes a pecuniary interest. If someone has said, hey, here's $50 to support my cause, which they're not going to do, that would be something I think that would be problematic. But coming out in favor of a group in a council meeting, particularly if that group is actually presenting to council, is not uncommon at all. So if anybody else wants to jump in on that, their question is in the chat, and you're more than welcome to correct me if I've got that wrong somehow, because I'm just talking from general experience. As we move on then to the role of council. So if I look at some of those last pieces about the kind of overall role of council, the role responsibilities, council's job then as a collective, so the group of individuals who were there to be strategic and think about governance and to challenge each other to do that as well. Sometimes it's not uncommon for examples to be used that are kind of the practical application of governance principles. So we may end up talking about Main Street potholes, but it's probably to support a principle about budget for infrastructure repair or something to that effect. So sticking to the governance, challenging each other on that, and allowing your city manager to challenge as well, respectfully, and say this is something we will deal with administration. The other thing is then to start at the top and work your way down. So if the municipality has a vision statement and a strategic plan, is for the decisions that come to council to be filtered through that. To be asked to say, for council to say, if administration is asking us to do something, or a group of citizens is asking us to do something, does this help us move towards the successful vision for what Stratford looks like a generation from now? And if it does, and it's all in alignment, then maybe that's the decision you should be considering. If, however, something isn't in alignment, then maybe that's something you ought not to be doing, you meaning the city, not to be doing, because it doesn't advance your vision. Now, the other thing that can happen here is no strategy survives first contact with reality. So it's quite likely that the situation is going to change. Nobody expected COVID, for example. So there may be some changes which are required to vision over time as well. So let's start at the top and work our way down. The tools that they've got, of course, are bylaws and policies and budget too, which is, there would be a bylaw around that. So those are the levers that we had talked to at the last session. Council is to provide direction to administration. I remember I did a city council orientation in California a few years ago, and the city manager said to council at the time, I don't care if we paint the barn red or if we paint the barn blue. I just want you to set a policy about it and we'll just go ahead and do it. So in that way, you get professional advice from the city manager and other experts that the city manager has hired, but it's apolitical advice. The city manager may comment on potential political ramifications of advice, but unless it's illegal or it goes counter to some other statute, it's likely that the city manager will follow council's request and decision on that. The CAO or city manager is the only employee of city council. So that's the person that city council has to hire. They have to evaluate and they have to replace as necessary. Now, replace could mean letting somebody go early. It could mean dealing with a retirement. It could mean somebody who's gone on to another job and having to backfill from that. And of course, council is responsible for budget as well. So city council will receive a lot of information from administration on budget, but it's ultimately up to council to decide. And of course, budgets are money in, money out. And there aren't a whole lot of money in things that can happen. City councils get money from property taxes, from fees and charges, from grants, from other orders of government, and that's really about it. So in order to increase revenue, you have to get revenue from one or more of those sources. And the expenses, of course, are everything the city spends its money on: short-term, long-term programs, services, those sorts of things. So there's a balancing act. Literally, there's a balancing act that has to happen there. And even if the city doesn't have priorities or a strategic plan, the city funds its priorities. If it's in the budget, it's a priority. If something isn't in the budget, it's not a priority. And that's kind of black and white, but it does. That's how typically it works. And once council has approved the budget, council steps back from finance and now just looks at how are we doing in terms of spending the money that we allocated. So there sometimes we'll receive things like a balance sheet or an income statement on a quarterly basis. But my take on it is the council ought to be thinking about variance from budget. How are we doing versus where we thought we ought to be? A lot of times it's just about timing. For example, property taxes come in pretty much over a short period. So you're going to show a negative variance from part of the year and a positive variance for much of the year. And hopefully at the end of the year, it all equals out to zero. Same with expenses, that insurance costs come in once a year, or construction season happens during summer, or you're going to blow the entire snow removal budget in winter. So variances are seasonal in that way and can pretty easily be explained. There's another question here we'll get to a little bit later too, but I'll just read it from Bob. He says, who leads the governance? Is it the mayor, or if council is or if the mayor is ineffective, council? We're going to talk about the mayor's role a little bit later as first among equals, which is kind of true, but not exactly. We work in something called the weak mayor system. And I'll leave it with that, Bob, but I'll say if I don't answer your question a little bit later on, please come back at me with it. The mayor does has a little bit more authority, but most of that authority is more of a moral authority based on the one person thing than it is voting authority, because they only get one vote like other people do too. So where is this? So Ken asked a question. I have experience with governance on nonprofit boards. I understand mission statements and strategic statements, but do many of the municipalities in Ontario actually have values list that is made public? I can't answer that question, Ken. I know whenever we do strategic planning, we include a set of values, half a dozen terms, if you like, that council can use to develop its strategic plan. I think it's important because I see it as that, as I mentioned earlier, that lens or filter. We actually do an exercise with city councils. We provide them with a list of about 270 values and ask them to work through an exercise to narrow it down. And the interesting question, actually, we did that with Prince George today. One of the questions that keeps coming up is whose values are these? Is this the values for, in these guys' case, 9 persons on city council? Is this the values for the city corporation? Or is this the value for the entire community? And it's mostly the middle set, because the strategic plan and anything the city does only really has an impact on what the city does. So it has an impact on bylaws and policies. It has an impact on programs and services. It doesn't have an impact on the weather, for example. It doesn't have an impact on what people do in the privacy of their own homes, for example. So the values are, when a decision comes before city council to be made, should we or should we not make it based on the value of accountability or transparency or helpfulness or clarity or whatever those values may be of the 270 list, or other ones that they might add. So a lot of strategic plans and websites therefore don't have values as part of them. I think it's pretty important that they do, and it's certainly something that we promote when we work with municipalities. Ken, I hope that answers your question. Deanna says, I would be interested in either this session or later as to whether I have experience with how municipalities are dealing with climate change and measures that can be taken within municipal jurisdiction. Deanna, I don't have that here today, but we are recording the chat, so I'll see if we can throw it in to one of the other ones as well, because I would want to make sure that these are resonant with you. So I have this theory I call the 4 buckets that council gets to deal with. Some they want to, some they don't want to deal with. But as a council comes into office, they run on a platform of whatever. They've had their shiny brochures and their lawn signs, and they managed to get more votes than some other people did. And now they find themselves part of the city's first team. So ultimately, what the council does is it maintains the accountability of administration through the city manager that they have hired. So if the city is not going in the right direction administratively, city council has the opportunity to change that. They develop and evaluate policies and programs. We've already kind of been through that. And anything else that they have to deal with by statute. And we're going to talk about that just momentarily. So in terms of the buckets themselves, however, when a council gets elected, newly elected, the first thing they almost have to deal with, whatever is left over from the last council. And I call that carry forward work. A lot of that tends to be infrastructure work. You started working on a new swimming pool, building a new swimming pool, for example. You're not going to stop just because a new council got elected. I mean, I suppose you could, but you're not going to. You're going to continue that infrastructure project through, which means that you have capital dollars committed to completing that, and then you have operating dollars committed to carrying forward with that too, which can be problematic because a lot of times capital dollars can come with cost sharing or grants, whereas operational dollars often can't. So if you build that new swimming pool, you may get money to help with building it, but you as a city still have to operate it, and there's a long-term expense to that through the life cycle of it. This piece here, the next one is the next bucket is what other orders of government have handed down. So there's the third bullet in this page talks about dealing with anything specifically required by statute. And so if the feds or the province hand something down to the city, you got to do it because of the way the way water flows, that it all flows downhill. The example I use on this a lot is cannabis legalization, which is pretty recent, but it's not something that municipalities had any control over. So when the federal government legalized the sale and consumption of recreational cannabis, they also passed on work to municipal governments, which didn't really want it, most likely. So municipalities had to change things like zoning for where cannabis shops could be located. They had to change smoking bylaws to include marijuana as well as tobacco and other things like that. So they really had no choice, but they had to deal with it because it was handed down from another order of government. The third piece is around crisis management. And this is the one that nobody really wants to deal with, but from time to time, everybody has to. I mean, we could use COVID, if you like, as a slow moving crisis. I'm pretty sure the city didn't want to spend a ton of money on COVID mitigation, COVID recovery, and it's still spending it now. Other municipalities are dealing with fires and floods and having to spend money, some of which they'll recoup from insurance and some of which they won't. But they have to deal with this crisis management. And there is a council role for crisis management, or particularly for the mayor around communications. The fourth bucket is actually the stuff that what council wanted to work on when they got elected. So this is what was in council members' platforms, the changes that they wanted to make. It's what's in the strategic plan that council approves about how the city is different a generation from now. So this is the interesting stuff that council really wants to work on. Unfortunately, a lot of the revenue or a lot of the money has already been allocated to some of the other things that council has to do. So there's not as much money there to do for council to do what it really wants to do. So this is, to me anyway, these are the pieces that council gets to work on, what I've called the 4 buckets. I made a reference earlier too about decision making. And this is something I ran into. I was working last time I was here. Well, this is just 2 weeks ago. I was in Melville, Saskatchewan. We were working with council and administration on a governance refresher. So midterm for council, they wanted to have a bit of a refresher on their orientation because the city had changed over some council members. New council members just learning how to do their job within days of the election don't tend to remember it all, and I completely understand why. Anyway, council, we were working with council last week, and some members of management asked us to make a couple of points, and these I thought were some pretty good ones. So in terms of decision making, One of them said every decision council makes has political implications, and it's a small p political in this case. But they're right, because you have limited resources. The resources are, you've got X number of dollars to spend, you've got X number of people's time to use, you've got political capital to expend as well. And if you spend it in one area, you can't spend it in another. The other thing is it's easy to add things. If all of a sudden people want pickleball courts, it's easy to build pickleball courts, and that keeps people happy. But there are cost implications to that too. So that becomes a political constraint or a budgetary constraint that has political overtones looking forward. Even that pool I referenced for capital build last time it was a political decision. And to close the pool at some point is equally a political decision too. And that's why there's always that trade-off, that you can either bring in more money, you can spend less, sorry, you can bring in more money, or you can spend less money. Either way, you have to balance the budget somehow, which is why there's that bit of a trade-off that has to happen between finance and capacity. That you've only got as many people as possible, and so you've only got as many people who actually work for the municipality, and you can't work them all 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And as such, then you reduce the efficiency of the organization if you're overworking people, and you can maybe do that for a little while, but you'll quickly burn people out as well. One of the questions that I do ask quite often is, how does council react when staff say no? I mean, it doesn't have to be quite so black and white as no, but understand, staff comes forward with an understanding of council that says, we have $1 to spend. If you want to spend an extra 50 cents in one area, what are we going to say no to? What are we going to stop doing that we were doing in the past? So that is a political decision. And how does council react to council saying, how does council react to administration saying that they have to stop doing something? This comes up in arguments like efficiency, where a candidate will run for office and say, city just needs to be more efficient, or we've got to trim the fat, or something to that effect. After decades of becoming more efficient and trimming the fat, there is no more fat to trim. There is no more efficiency to be had. Or if there is, it's the law of diminishing returns. So at some point, the city manager has to stand in front of council and say, you know, we got all the inefficiencies out of this operation. If you want us to do something differently, we have to stop doing something we're currently doing, which is perfectly legitimate. But some councils react much better to that than others do. Councils who are more experienced or who trust their administrations are better with it, potentially than new councils who figure administration is just trying to pull the wool over their eyes. So change also comes with a cost. No council member gets elected thinking, or with the platform of, I want to keep things exactly the same way for the next 4 years. So we want to move the city from where it is right now to some ideal future state of generation from now, or even something slightly different 4 years from now. That's why people run, is they think that they have something that they can offer to their community. And I use strategic plans here as something that I see as really important. There are official plans in some places, and municipal development plans in some places, and official community plans in other places, all of which are overarching documents that say how the city is going to react over the next 20, 30, 40 years. And that provides some direction to administration to start working in that direction. What things are we going to start doing? What things are we going to stop doing? How are we going to bring people to town? Do we want any more people here? What kind of business sectors are we after? Are we going to offer recreational opportunities? All those sorts of questions that come up. We do recognize too that I used the phrase earlier that no strategy survives first contact with reality. And that's why this comment about, or the point about unintended consequences comes in too. That as somebody mentioned climate change in the chat here, as more and more diligence is required of municipalities to adapt to climate change and other ecological factors, there's a greater regulatory requirement put on municipalities. So somebody was saying before, when we needed a ditch before, we used to just dig a ditch and nobody cared. But now we have to do an environmental impact assessment and a whole bunch of other things too. So we still end up with a ditch, but it's a whole lot more expensive because there's regulatory oversight being required that didn't used to be. So one of the unintended consequences of digging that ditch is having to incur the cost, legitimately so, of all these things that we didn't used to have to do too. Capacity comes in because every time we ask somebody to do something, it means they can't do something else. So unless you add another person or some more dollars, you're still restrained in what you can actually do. So that's a bit of an overview on the role of council itself. It's the biggest overview through because as we go through this, because it's the largest body and the most significant. Was there anything that I didn't deal with that can be that people had questions about as part of this particular section before we move into the next section? Because as I look through the questions online, it doesn't look like that. Somebody said, oh, here we go. Mark says it's break time, is it? All right. So it's 4:02 on my time, 7:02 your time. I will just respond here to Ken says, I have to disagree with your statement that no council will want to have things stay the same as they have been. In Stratford, we often see council quoting a now very old survey that citizens want to maintain the small town feel. Stratford's population growth is anemic. Okay, I still think that all elected officials are elected because they want to make things better for their community. Part of that might be around community size as well. And I was saying to council here in Prince George today that the ideal size of any municipality seems to be the size when I moved here. Anything after that becomes urban sprawl. And so there are certainly some constraints there. So I buy your point. I'm not sure I would agree that Stratford, and I don't know Stratford Council very well. I've only met with them once though so far. And I don't know how old the survey is. I would suggest too, though, that data gathering is an important part of making informed decisions. So if there are some communities I work with, a lot of communities I work with will actually do a survey, a citizen satisfaction survey every 2 years or every 5 years to try and gauge some of the soft side of what municipalities are doing to benefit the people who live there. Of course, there's a referendum once every 4 years, but that lumps everything together. So you may vote for or against somebody based on a particular stand they take, but you get everything else that goes with it as well. So Ken, you should give me a call at some point, and I'd be interested in having a longer conversation with you about that. So our timekeeper, Mark, says, let's take a bit of a break. Why don't we do that? My clock here, it's 4 minutes after the hour. I will come back at 6 minutes after the hour. And if anybody wants to engage in a conversation for the next 2 minutes, please do. And I won't cover anything else new. Unless somebody wants to write questions or somebody wants to unmute themselves or raise their hand, I'm more than happy to respond as well to that too. Cheers. Well, Mark, I hope you're making really good use of your break.
Ian,
Yes.
I have a question.
Certainly. Yeah.
Based on your wide experience and exposure to so many different municipalities, can you tell me what's the rough balance between municipalities that have ward systems of representation versus municipalities that don't have wards but have council members at large?
Yeah, so first of all, almost all rural municipalities are ward-based or division-based. So if we ignore rural municipalities, so in BC where I am, they're called regional districts. In Saskatchewan, they're called rural municipalities. You've got counties, Alberta's got counties, so those sort of things are there. So if I ignore those and I look at just the urbans, there are really, really small urbans, which, let me try again. The cutoff point seems to be at around about 100,000 people. And municipalities that are greater than 100,000 in population seem to be predominantly ward-based. Those that are under 100,000 urbans are predominantly at large. And I put that down to how big a constituency can one person reasonably represent. And in a ward-based, in a major city, if one member of council may represent 100,000 people, there's no way one person can represent 1 million people, say. So that's typically the cutoff point I see. And when it comes to that, even though it's 100,000, if it's 110,000, they'll still go with 3 or 4 or 5 wards, which will reduce the size, the population that has to be represented back down to the level of kind of a medium-sized municipality. So at a break at 100,000, if you break that down into 4 wards, everybody's now represented, or 5 wards, because you need an odd number. No, you need an even number of wards. It'd be 25,000 each, which is much more manageable. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Deanna asks, I'm interested in the scope for policy innovation. Recognizing there's limited scope for new initiatives, do you have any examples of policy innovation at the municipal level, for example, on affordable housing? So affordable housing comes up every place I go. And part of that is because it has an impact. It's not really it doesn't really fall into the authority of most municipalities. It's more a provincial and federal thing. CMHC as an example of that. However, when we deal with issues with homeless camps or tent cities, the social issues that are associated with that have meant that municipalities have had to deal with housing as a social issue anyway, even if that's perhaps, if you like, one of those things that's required or downloaded from other orders of government. There are some really good examples of housing, affordable housing or attainable housing, if you like, across the country. CMHC, as I mentioned, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corp, has some good examples. I think the city of Victoria is doing a good job. The city of, is it Medicine Hat, Alberta, claims that it has not cured, it has solved its homeless problem. I don't quite know how, or whether it's gotten worse again over COVID, but they were doing some pretty active work on it as well. So there are some really good examples. There's an organization, no, that's not a good example. So there are some good examples around the country. And in that case, that the municipal policy piece is enabling rather than restricting in a lot of ways. It says the municipality will do something, even though it's not really within their bailiwick, because they recognize that the people who live in that community are people that they need to look after or their families. So it's just something that certainly does have an impact on municipalities and that they're having to deal with more and more. The federal government of the last little while has been pushing homelessness strategies. Whether that will continue under the new government or not, I don't know, but it is something that there are some really good examples around the country. There are probably some pretty terrible examples too of municipalities that just provide bus tickets, which is kind of the opposite, I suppose. But, so it does get dealt with for better or for worse. Ken, you put your hand up. I can deal with one or two more, and then we'll kind of move on if we can.
Yeah, it's just a follow up to the point about affordable housing and what
Sure.
cities can and can't do. There are innovative solutions that you see other cities doing, such as tiny homes and even 3D homes. And there's all these kinds of, fixes, quick fixes or long-term fixes for homelessness. Are cities able to actually, I'm not sure how to phrase this. I know they have to live by property standards that are set by the province and such, but are they ever allowed to initiate or say, we're going to do a pilot project, and yeah, the property standards, typically wouldn't allow this, but we're going to create it and make it a pilot project and just give it a try. Can cities do that kind of thing, or are they forbidden essentially because the provinces basically own the cities?
It's a little beyond my areas of expertise. So what I am saying is potentially a little bit of speculation in this case. So things like that are in zoning in terms of density. A lot of cases. How many? What lot coverage can there be? What percentage? How many people can live? Width. Anyway, those sort of urban density pieces. And I have heard of those being done, but a lot of them are collaborative in nature. So it's recognizing that there are social impediments as well as purely physical ones as well. So provinces working with municipalities to run pilots that way. So that's as far as I can comment. I think there's wisdom to that, to looking at the benefits of a whole community, if you like.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to keep going, if that's all right. I'm keeping an eye on the chat box as well as we go. So we've dealt with council. Now we'll speak specifically about the councillor themselves. That's the individual who got elected, whether at large or by award. And if we look at the job of the individual member of council, I mean, it's quite reflective of council as a whole. And as such, looking at the benefits for the city as a whole is quite important and one of the key considerations. And this, as I mentioned earlier, is of significant impact on ward-based communities versus those that aren't because of the geographic constraints, but also recognizing that if you put a water treatment plant in one part of the city, it's going to have an impact on the entire city. But so where's the best place to put it? Looking at policy again is here, as is participation in meeting, again, kind of table stakes stuff, and the direction of the CAO. So the direction has to be done, even though it shows up here as the role of the councillor, the individual councillor cannot direct the CAO to do anything. That's council's job. And then the council member also has to keep the confidences, so keep confidential stuff confidential. Stratford does, of course, outline its role of council and councillor in the procedure bylaw, a lot of which is some of the pieces I've just mentioned at a higher level, but these deal with it more specifically. So the bolding is added by me. So the representation piece, of course, in representative government is really important, as is developing, evaluating, and potentially rescinding policies and programs, starting doing things, modifying them as situations change, and then stopping doing them if they're no longer required. Determining what services and programs that the municipality provides now and ought to provide into the future. Ensuring that everything, that the practices and policies are in place to actually let administration do what administration does, to take some of the shackles off. Oftentimes I ask members of administration 2 questions. I say, what can council do to help you do your job? And the second question is, what barriers are there that council can help remove for you? And sometimes that really generates some interesting discussion. Accountability and transparency shows up here in your procedure bylaw. Transparency means different things to different people and could in fact be a session all by itself. Financial integrity. One of the interesting things about local government is individual civil liability that council members sometimes inherit if the municipality spends imprudently on things that they ought not to be spending on. One example of that sometimes is, I shouldn't say this is Ontario for sure, but I know in some provinces that if a municipality or council gets money from a grant and spends that money on something else, the individual members of council could be individually and severally liable for that. An example could be, we get money to refurbish the ice plant in the curling rink, but we actually spend the money on buying a new mowing lawnmower. So that is something that could cause problems for that. So financial integrity and carrying out the duties that are required under the Act shows up here too. So that's, if we look specifically within the council, that's some of the things that individual members of council have to do. So, and the mayor is part of that. So the mayor has to do those things plus. So if we look at the mayor themselves, you of course elect a mayor at large. Most mayors, using the title mayor, most mayors in Canada are elected at large. Some, however, are appointed from within. I've been doing some work in Australia recently, and most of their mayors are actually appointed from within and only for 1-year terms, which is an interesting difference between our system and theirs. There was a question that was asked earlier too about the authority of a mayor, and I'm hopeful that this is kind of what helps cover that off. And I've lost whoever it was on my chat up the list, but if I don't answer your question, please repeat it again. The mayor, like anybody else, is a member of council. They are elected by the people of the community to serve the community as a whole. The mayor is a voting member of council in most places in Canada, though not all places in Canada. There are some differences as well. Sometimes the mayor will only vote to break a tie, and there's some interesting ramifications to that. The mayor, for most part, is a member of all city council committees. So committees that are established by city council by bylaw. So not, for example, inherently the Chamber of Commerce or the Arts Board. So the mayor is a member of council, and in Stratford's case, the mayor is a voting member of these committees. It's not always the case. The procedure bylaw lays that out and can make exceptions in this case from, say, the Municipal Act. In some places, the mayor isn't a member of council committees, and in some places, the mayor can't vote. We are something that's called the weak mayor system, and that generates no end of laughs for some mayors. And all it says is that the mayor has no more voting authority than any other member of council, and that's what weak mayor means. And there's a difference between our parliamentary system, which we just voted about, and local government. Obviously, in our parliamentary system, you don't directly elect a prime minister. The prime minister is the head of the party that has the most representation in the House of Commons. Whereas we do directly elect our mayors here. And we sometimes use the term, the mayor is first among equals. In some ways that's true, and in some ways it's not true. So in terms of voting authority, it is true. The mayor has no more voting authority than any other member of council. In some cases has less because they can't vote. However, I had a city mayor challenge me on this a few years ago, and I think he may be right. He said it's not really true, because if it were true, then the mayor would have exactly the same resources as any other member of council. The mayor wouldn't have a bigger office. The mayor wouldn't chair all the meetings. The mayor wouldn't have his own executive assistant. The mayor wouldn't be the one who visits who greets the visiting delegation from Ukraine. So in actual fact, it's kind of first among equals, but it's like the animal farm with all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. So the mayor does have a little bit more not even statutory authority, if you like, than some of the members of council. And some mayors have told me too that if there's an invitation that comes to the mayor to come speak to an organization, mayor can't make it and says, can councillor so-and-so come in my stead? Sometimes the answer is no, because they just wanted the mayor because the mayor is the mayor is the mayor. So they're in that way, the mayor sometimes is not first among equals. And I think there's a really interesting debate to be had about that. Municipalities will also have the role of deputy mayor, and the deputy mayor will fill in for the mayor when the mayor either can't or when the mayor is not available. Sometimes the mayor is not available because the mayor is off on vacation somewhere. Sometimes the mayor is not available because he'd be in a conflict of interest if you did participate, in which case the deputy mayor will take over. And oftentimes this is set out either annually or at the start of a council's term about a rotation through the deputy mayor schedule. Ideally, every member of council is deputy mayor for a time. Now, some members of council don't want it. Some will change every 6 months. Some will change every 8 months, depending on how the math works. Some will repeat. Others won't do it at all. Another piece with this is way council actually is seated. And oftentimes council sits around the council table for the same way for 4 years. I'm an advocate of at the same time you change the deputy mayor, you change the seating order in council as well. So that people end up either sitting beside other people throughout we go, or they end up breaking up people who aren't sitting together very well. So in much the same way the deputy mayor role can rotate, so could the seating in council rotate as well. There's a note here from a couple of people. I'm just going to go through a couple of questions. Ken said, specific questions about closed meetings and confidentiality. Stratford had a notable overstep regarding the Shinyi glass plant. May a council member take the issue directly to the integrity commissioner and provide what is normal in confidence information? I'm not speculate on this one, but integrity commissioners are not common across Canada. So it's not and where there are integrity commissioners, they don't always have to be lawyers. I was an integrity commissioner for the city of St. Albert, just north of Edmonton, for a period of 6 months just to get it set up, for example, and I'm not a lawyer. So council members, I'm not going to comment on that without actually doing a whole lot of more research on it, because I don't know, and I don't want to give you information that's not correct. But I would suspect that the integrity commissioner would be covered by some sort of solicitor-client privilege if they were a lawyer anyway. Your second question was, may a council member make public that a request has been made to the integrity commissioner without revealing other details? I can't comment on that at all, actually, just because I don't know. It's not something that I'm familiar with. Can I apologize for that? The second question, there's another question here from Sharon. I'd like to learn more about the misuse of non-disclosure agreements in a municipal context. I don't think there are such things as NDAs. Now, please correct me, Sharon, if I'm wrong, but council would be covered under their oath of office and statute around confidentiality rather than signing an NDA. The municipality may be asked to sign an NDA by a third party, potentially if it's sharing proprietary information, in which case the NDA would be between the municipality and the entity rather than individual members of council. My suspicion would be if that does happen, that the municipality's legal counsel would be involved in it as well. Where should you begin your research? Oh boy, statute for sure to figure out what would be part of an NDA if they are used in the context of municipal government in Ontario or not, and if so, when they might be. It is something potentially boy, like Ken's stuff, I'm not sure that I can go much further than that just because I'm not familiar with the Ontario specifics on non-disclosure agreements and whether they are used in a municipal context. Sorry about that. The next question from Mike says, can the mayor make decisions about zoning, for example, without involving council? No. No, council has to make those kinds of decisions. So if it's about a change, this shouldn't be quite so explicit. If it's about a change that a change to zoning that the city controls, it has to be a decision of council, not of a member of council. So it can't be done by any member of council, mayor, or anybody else. It has to be a majority of members of council. We have run into this before, not specific to this topic, but we ran into a conflict between a mayor who thought they were, who didn't realize that they were like the chief elected official versus the chief executive officer for the municipality. So we'd run into a mayor in a municipality we did an investigation in who was signing contracts on behalf of the municipality without the municipality knowing it. And that was causing all kinds of legal trouble for the municipality and ultimately for the mayor as well. The mayor ended up sanctioned and most of his duties were removed for the majority of an entire council term because council had actually done the sanction of the mayor. Interestingly, that same mayor was, as I mentioned, was sanctioned for the majority of the term, believed he was right and chose to run again in the next election. As was his right, he ended up getting 5% of the vote as an incumbent mayor and certainly didn't do very well, obviously. So the public does pay attention to these sorts of things. I'm going to keep going on. I'm on with that. Where are we? Apologize. The role of mayor. Sorry. Mayor is the chair of council, of course, unless for some reason the mayor shouldn't be the chair of council. If council meets in committee of the whole, which is not a formal council meeting, oftentimes that rotates between other members of council or the deputy mayor takes on the chair in that way. They're the primary contact. Some people come to town, they want to meet the city. Oftentimes it's the mayor who, again, meets that delegation visiting from Ukraine. They are often the elder statesperson for the municipality and as such are looked upon to at least seek consensus, not necessarily agreement, but common understanding among members of council. As the nature of the relationship between council and manager works, it's useful to have a one-on-one. So one person, the mayor and the city manager have a relationship, though there are principles at play there too. The mayor, the chief administrative officer, a city manager, is no more accountable to the mayor than any other member of council. But for the ease of conversation, sometimes a weekly one-on-one between the mayor and the CAO does happen. And the principle behind that is within X number of hours of that meeting happening, the mayor is expected to report to the rest of council about what transpired. And if there are topics to be brought up at next week's meeting, council members want to have brought up, to ask the mayor to add those to the agenda as well. We've already commented on members of council committees that are here and key representatives and ceremonies. So I mentioned the things like Canada Day or Remembrance Day. Oftentimes it's the mayor or the mayor's delegate or designate who would actually partake in that. They will be the one who attends meetings with the minister and will be providing input into what's going on with other orders of government and policies that come up. So that's the overall piece. In the procedure bylaw, this is specifically how it's spoken to. The mayor is the chief executive officer of the municipality, and that is interesting wording because it's not in place across Canada. I've seen it more commonly as the chief elected officer, because sometimes that type of CEO that you see written here can be a little bit problematic. The mayor presides over council meetings, again, unless they are not able to for one reason or another. Providing leadership, we talked about on the last slide. Providing information and recommendations to council of some of the pieces which come a little bit later. Representing the municipality, we talked about. Carrying out the duties of the head of council, which are described in the Municipal Act or other acts as well. So this just goes to show that what's showing up in municipal bylaw is reflective of kind of the softer side of the mayor's role, if you like. There's one more piece here as a chief executive officer. They have to, essentially it's the golden rule piece. They have to uphold the purpose of the municipality. They have to be involved in public involvement. And we're going to talk about that for the most part in our next session next week on engagement, representing the municipality, enhancing well-being, which is an interesting choice of words because well-being is becoming more and more popular as a reason for someone to live in a community or to move to a community to enhance their well-being. And I could certainly see that in the case of Stratford. Dealing with council's representative or as council's rep and dealing with other, they call this levels of government. I use almost exclusively the term orders of government because I see each one as separate and distinct. There is a bit of a paternal relationship, I suppose, but I think there's value in each one. So I prefer to think of them each as separate, distinct orders of government rather than senior orders or lower orders of government. That's just me. So that's the piece on the mayor. Before we move on to the city manager themselves, I'm just going to look through some of the questions. How does council police themselves? They're working on the right things and they don't get into too much of the detail that staff are to do. Well, this is an interesting one. That's the whole purpose behind strategic planning, actually, because council are the boss. If they want to get involved in detail, sometimes they do. They ought not to. They are the governance entity for the municipality. They hire experts to do the day-to-day work. They ought not to be doing that. However, what we sometimes see is if administration isn't doing what council believes administration ought to be doing effectively, and they don't trust administration, that's when we see council members starting to get involved in the detail, far too much into the detail. The opposite is also true, that sometimes we see administration starting to stray into governance if council won't lead. If council just wants to stand pat and doesn't want to make any decisions, chooses not to innovate or not to prudently risk in order to innovate, sometimes a little bit of that role will be usurped by administration until council pushes back or until a prudent administrator realizes that that's what's going on and pulls back. Because when push comes to shove, it's the city manager who gets shoved every time. And that gets a bit to the fit of that person as well. We're going to speak to momentarily. So how does council police themselves? They have codes of ethics, codes of conduct. I've also seen like a covenant between the city manager and members of council that say, within the bounds of statute, this is what I will do as city manager. And council says, this is what we will do. You both sign off on it and you post it on the wall of council chambers and it becomes part of orientations and annual reviews and all those sorts of things. So there is that. Ultimately, if it's legal, then there are legal ramifications as well for contravening statute or even contravening bylaw. I think we talked last time about disqualification or censure of members of council that sometimes happens as well, though that does require external involvement. In your case, for Ontario, of course, the integrity commissioner, though there's oftentimes more subtle push power than that is available to members of council because of things like political capital that some of them have, that some of them don't, and reputations that some of them have built and some of them have seen degrade as well. So all those sorts of things are there in terms of how council can constrain themselves. Fundamentally, however, it can be certainly quite awkward. I'm going to move on to the city manager role. So we've dealt with council, we've dealt with councillor, and we've dealt with mayor. And nobody has their hands up to the best of my knowledge, and I think we're caught up on the question. So I'm just going to move on. So city manager. The fundamental to me is that council doesn't want to look after or can't look after the business of Stratford 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So they hire somebody to do it for them. And the person they hire is the city manager. And city manager in turn can't spend 24/7 looking after the city business and also isn't an expert in everything the city does either. So in this case, she's hired other people who she believes are experts to run departments. And those experts in turn have hired others to do the work as well. So there's that cascading alignment, if you like, that you start with vision and mission and strategic plan. It flows to council to provide direction to administration. It goes through the city manager and then on down the list. The term that often comes up here is what interests council fascinates the city manager. What interests the city manager fascinates the next level of managers and on down the line. It's a one-way street, however. I sometimes joke that what interests the lifeguard doesn't necessarily fascinate the mayor. So might do, but perhaps not as well. So council provides legislation through bylaws and policies, and ultimately budget and directives and things like that. And then they provide the budget for the administrative strength. The city manager then does that. So council hires their expert. They ought to be reviewing their expert every year. And their job then is to hire that person, to evaluate that person, and to replace that person as need warrants. Now, replace could, of course, be voluntary or not. Hopefully, if it's not voluntary, there's been a pretty robust process to work things out before something goes really bad. And oftentimes that has to do more with fit than it does with skill. The city manager who was hired by the last council, for example, may not fit well with the next council. And that just happens to be an issue that is fairly common. But before giving up, you should certainly work their way through it. So hire and evaluate that person every year. The reason for the evaluation is protection on both sides. So if the city manager has no evaluation that's done for 3, 4, 5 years, or one that's done in a really cursory fashion, then neither side really has a leg to stand on if things start to go sour at some point. So you want to understand trends before they become significant so you can do something about it. And the comment at the bottom here about keep your nose in and your fingers out is for council. It's to say to council, understand your governance role, and to say to the city manager, who is the professional person who has been doing this probably for years, in the case of a city the size of Stratford, has lots of experience growing up through the ranks, potentially in Stratford, or potentially coming in from another municipality that maybe was just a little bit smaller. So that person then has a pretty good understanding of the role they have, and probably has a pretty good understanding of the role of governance versus administration. And for council to recognize that everybody who works for the municipality, with the exception of the CAO, isn't their staff person. So it's not council staff, so they can't manage them, they can't evaluate them, they can't ask them to do something, because that creates all kinds of issues around organizational behavior and organizational structure. So for council, keep your nose in and your fingers out. If we look at the city, mayor, councillors, and the CAO comprise governance. Primarily, of course, it's the mayor and other members of council providing their direction to the CAO. So the CAO stays in that realm of governance. I sometimes talk about the CAO having to require executive decision-making. And that to me is, what are the pieces, what are the skills we need in order to get the job done that council wants us to do? And then the CAO going out and finding those pieces and putting them in the right boxes, if you like, on the org chart. That sometimes ignores the person as well. And that's sometimes why senior managers within municipalities will move on involuntarily or potentially voluntarily, is because they no longer fit the requirement of the municipality, even though they may be really good people and have good skills that are better used somewhere else. When we move down to talk about administration, you'll see that the CAO forms the part of administration as well. And then everybody else who works for the municipality, from that city manager on down to the lifeguard I mentioned a few minutes ago, actually is part of administration. And I mentioned executive decision-making. As we start to look down here at, say, the director of corporate services or the director of public works, and this is just a sample, by the way, this isn't Stratford. I think about the difference of decision-making here. And in this case, the directors are doing what I would typically call management decision-making. So they are being provided with the human resources that are available to them. They're trying to match the human with the task that needs to be done. And sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't work terribly well, and we end up having to move things around and fit them. But unlike the CAO, sometimes they don't have these people, the directors, don't have the ability to move humans in and out just so that they can move skills in and out as well. They're provided with a series of people that they make fit best as they can. And of course, for citizens, you probably run into those frontline staff the most. You run into the person in the rec center who's taking tickets. You run into the bylaw officer who's just put a parking ticket under your window, or people like that, or maybe a municipal assessor. Those are the people who are actually doing a ton of the work. So that's the municipal structure. I also quite frequently talk about how information flows from one place to another. And in this case, somebody said earlier on about having information. And the problem in this case is that for easy decisions, you will probably have all the information. Council's asked to make a decision on whether we should celebrate Canada Day this year or not. And that's a pretty easy decision. People put up their hands or they don't based on what they know. However, if decisions become increasingly complex, longer term, more convoluted, the less council is going to have all the information, if you like. And so they start having to make decisions based on the best information that they have at the time. And they will do that. They will sometimes realize after a few years that there's more information that's come out and we'd have made a different decision. But for the most part, councils make pretty good decisions on the future of the community based on the information that they have at the time. That becomes reflected in things like bylaws and policies that may be created or modified or rescinded. It's also sometimes follows through directives, council asking for a study on something or other from administration that gives them a few weeks or a few months to pull something together so that council ultimately can make that policy decision or that bylaw decision. A tool we often see used is something called a request for decision, or RFD. So rather than just giving a report to council that some consultant has designed or an engineer has come up with, council will request that be framed in the context of as a request for decision. What's the decision that council is being asked to make by administration, by the city manager, if you like? So give us a bit more information than just this report that we get. What's the issue we're being asked to deal with? What's the background? How far back has this thing gone? Are there other iterations that we've had to deal with in the past? One thing I typically promote is what kind of an impact does this decision have on the strategic plan, or vice versa? How are we advancing the vision of our community by making this decision? Now, the small decisions, maybe not much, but those really big decisions that you don't have all the information for might have a tie into something you wanted to see done in the strategic plan, so that does become important. So is there a tie on the strategic plan? And is there a budget implication as well? The answer to the last question is almost always yes, this is going to cost us some money, or it might save us some money as well. This request ought to have options. So a preferred option or a recommended option that administration recommends to council, as well as maybe 1 or 2 or 3 alternate options that council could consider if it's not in favor of the first option. We suggest this because if council is accepting all the recommendations of administration all the time, then they're not thinking for themselves properly. Now, administration should be pretty much in tune with council and should have a pretty good understanding of what's really going on. And so there's likely to be that the recommended option is adopted most of the time, just probably not all the time. So that give them an option, give them the alternate recommendations. This requires some nuance as well. So I've mentioned here that the administrative expertise, so council, unless by accident, doesn't have an engineer on it. So we would be asking the city engineer for some potential professional advice on this request for the decision and the implications that maybe council hasn't thought of. As with background, how this is something that's been running for 5 or 10 years. How do we get to where we are today? And finally, culture. So if we look at the values of our community, how does this support the values that Stratford has expressed for itself? So this is a request for information that I suspect the city the size of Stratford would use, but not all of them do for sure. Think a little bit about hazards as well. So these are some of the hazards that we see showing up in municipalities. And it's a little bit like that boiling frog, that it's not bad until it's bad. That these are the sorts of things that are indicators that something might not be going as well as it should. So for example, I made a reference earlier, but there's a hazard of an individual council member directing the CEO or asking the city manager to do something. So rather than council as a whole asking, an individual member of council asking, that's a hazard because it doesn't reflect the will of council, just an individual member. And this could also be in a council meeting, but it could also be an individual member of council meeting in the CAO's office to have a conversation about something. And that could be perceived as providing direction. Council providing direction to people other than the CAO. Of course, everybody other than the CAO is the CAO's staff, not council staff. So by doing an end run around the city manager, even if it's not intentional, it can put that other person in a really awkward situation. Now, if the request is the same from council as it would be from the city manager, no big deal, I guess. However, what happens when the decision that council would suggest of this person and the request that the city manager would make of this person are different? Who's the boss in this case? And that really puts the staff member in a difficult spot. So that ends up here with the CAO not necessarily knowing what council really wants, particularly if there's that end run being done around that person. And it also, as I mentioned, ends up with that city staff person being put in a really awkward situation. Who do they pay attention to? It's really hard to say no to your boss's boss. So those are some of the things we see that councils sometimes do that can get them into trouble. To stop that or to avoid it in the first place is, I say, policy, policy, policy. The idea behind policy, and we talked about this in our first session, is to be predictable. So that council doesn't have, that administration doesn't have to keep coming back to council to ask the same questions again and again and again. And if if administration only acts based on what council formally asks it to do, it's a lot safer to do that. It may be a formal bylaw or policy, or it may be that directive about doing a little bit more research and bringing a report back that I mentioned before, so the council can make a decision a little bit into the future. And that's also about council acting by resolution. The only way actually council can do stuff is if they vote on it. It can't just be an off-the-cuff suggestion. This gets to some of the comment about in-camera meetings or closed sessions, that council can't make decisions in camera, can't give direction to administration in camera either, and it must act by resolution in open session. Council members need to hold each other in check too. This is one of the other items we sometimes find in ethics problems, is more again like that boiling frog a little bit ago, that council members may just let each other off the hook and it becomes okay, and then it becomes a part of the culture of the community that we don't really kind of keep an eye on what other members of council are doing. However, if members of council are telling other members of council that something isn't good enough or isn't the right way of doing it, then I think that tends to beget a more positive culture. Now that needs to be done respectfully, and it usually happens quietly and maybe behind the scenes, but at least knowing that somebody else is looking and paying attention. And the final comment on mitigation here is, because council's hired an expert, allowing that expert to do their job in the human resource realm and organizational behavior realm as well, and push back to council to tell council that what they're doing is inappropriate or illegal in some cases, and then provide alternative courses of action. This is one of those things that could sometimes happen in a council meeting, but is more likely to happen, again, quietly behind the scenes, to say that whatever council is doing or an individual member of council is doing is inappropriate, to hopefully build that culture into a positive culture. So those are some of the hazards that we see. If I think about how to stay focused, if you're looking at the role of the city manager, know that what interests the city council fascinates the CAO. It's one way to stay employed with a municipality, of course, is to understand the role of the politicians versus the administrators. That one is there to carry out the will of the other, so long as it is ethical and legal. And when we think about that, staying focused, the city manager has a contract, an annual performance agreement, if you like, and that performance agreement ought to have goals in it, annual performance goals that we can measure against. So the expectations are clear at the beginning of the year and can be checked at the end of the year. So as part of that is looking back on the last year. How did we do? Did we accomplish the things we thought we were going to accomplish? If great, let's celebrate that. If not, is there a reason why? I mean, COVID is a pretty good reason why right now. The point being, we're not trying to beat anybody with a stick, but we are trying to learn from why things may not have worked so we can adapt next year. So as we look back and what completed, we can celebrate that. We can move some of the stuff forward. We don't want to throw babies out with bathwater. So there's probably some good work that hasn't been completed yet. And that then becomes potentially goals for next year. And one of the big goals is often we want to see the CAO help us as council push forward the strategic plan, complete some of the goals that are in that strategic plan. So that's the measurable goals piece. So we can look at the end of the year and say, how did we do? Looking for benchmarks and trends. We sometimes do things like board self-evaluation for school boards or for municipal councils. We've done it for police boards and commissions as well, where we will set a benchmark 1 year and then essentially run a very similar set of questions year over year over year, so that we can start looking for trends. What's getting better? What's getting worse? Where do we need to put some attention over the next few years? And that can certainly be done for councils and city managers as well. If you look at a 360 evaluation, we may be interested in what other staff have to say. We often find if we do a municipal investigation of some sort, that what we heard, there are several versions of the truth. That if we ask other people what's really going on, sometimes we get a slightly different perspective than if we just ask one person what's going on. That's one way of staying focused. If it's council, then they can stay focused by reviewing themselves. I made a reference to this board self-evaluation that can be done for council every year as well. How well are we doing as an organization, as a group of council members? How well is our chair doing? How well is the mayor doing? How well are we sticking to what we ought to be sticking to? That sort of a self-evaluation and points for reflection and improvement as well. If you think about an ongoing evaluation, of course, you get a big evaluation once every 4 years as a council member, because you either get elected or you get democratically retired, assuming you chose not to run again. If we think about that, though, between elections, engagement, getting the pulse of the community is really important and really good. The board effectiveness self-evaluation I've referenced, the 360 feedback, even though it's not direction coming from staff, you can ask. An example of that is every time I go to a municipality, if I fly in and I'm getting a cab to the hotel, I always ask the cabbie what he or she thinks of the city council. And it's a very small sample size, of course, but those guys seem to have their finger on the pulse of the municipality, and most of the time they're quite happy to share it. And then for council as well, comments from the CAO, because the CAO, if they've been there sometime, or have been in other municipalities, have an idea of what works and what doesn't work. The only difference between an elected official and me is they got more votes. There's no inherent difference. So they're not experts the day after they got elected, and they should be looking to improve. You can measure against other municipalities too, or by some agreed upon ideal state for your municipality. Now, sometimes that gets competitive in nature, and that's not terribly helpful. But if you can find best practices from somewhere else or wise practices from somewhere else and adapt them to yourself, I think that's a neat way of doing it. And sometimes that happens with municipal associations, elected official associations as well. I have a note here on just a couple of questions I'm going to get to right now. Giving direction in camera, says Ken. Last city council meeting here, clerk reported that direction was given in an item in camera. I sense you meant no direction can be given to administration via the CAO in closed session, but if direction is given to councillors by the mayor, is that legal? It's not binding. Until a decision is taken in public, there's no action considered to have been taken. And all of the decisions themselves, any motion would have to be done in public. That motion could be associated with a bylaw or a policy or a directive. The one exception, of course, is you can have a motion to come out of in camera. That's it. And there's often a discussion that happens behind those closed doors in camera properly. Sometimes in some places I've seen that abused, and that seems to be cultural more than anything else. And it's usually not a one-off. It's usually that boiling frog again about some council beginning to see that they get away with a whole lot more stuff behind closed doors than they ought to be getting away with. And that becomes a systemic problem. And in some places we've actually requested changes be made to bylaws. We had one where there was something called a CAO's briefing or a city manager's briefing, where he'd get together with city council before a meeting and talk about go through the agenda and talk about the things that were likely to come up during the agenda. And essentially that was a meeting within a meeting prior to a meeting, and that was a no-no. And they did actually change based on that. So decisions and direction can't be provided in camera. There's another question. Sorry, misdirecting this other question, so repeating it. Question about the clerk. City clerk acts as a neutral chief elections officer of city elections, plus is on the frontline support for council. In your experience, do all city clerks report to the CAO? Most of the time, yes. The city clerks do, and because, again, in our Canadian system of government, for the most part, city council has a single employee, and that is the city manager or CAO. So by default, then the city clerk would be responsible to somebody else, city manager, or maybe if you use general managers, sometimes a general manager of community service or corporate services or something like that, the city clerk would be accountable to that person. Please correct me if I'm wrong in this case. Somebody says, are there directions in municipal acts that give a clerk supremacy in some scenarios regarding neutrality or reduce a CAO's administrative line reporting? I'm not aware of that. City clerks, if you talk about city clerk as, say, the chief returning officer for an election, they would be bound by election statute. And that election statute would have primacy over direction that's provided by the city manager or anybody else for that matter, because it would be a provincial act in that case, in which case the clerk during the election process would be responding to the Election Act rather than to city bylaw or policy. I don't know if that answered your question on that, but it's so in Canada, I think I shouldn't be equivocal about this, but I don't think in Canada there are acts which say that there are two people responsible to city council. Now, I could be wrong on that, but I don't think so. In the United States, it's different. Oftentimes the city solicitor is also directly accountable to council. Sometimes there are contractors who are responsible directly to council. The best example of that is the city auditor. Now, the auditor is typically hired by city council and so reports to city council. For practical purposes, however, the auditor works almost all the time with the city's finance department. But what that does mean is the auditor reports to council, not to city management. So city council could meet with the auditor without city manager present as well, if they chose to do that. So anyway, that's the getting focused piece on city manager and on council. And that actually brings us pretty close to the end of where we wanted to be today. Oops. Next time we meet, so the next session we have is on engagement and communication. Some of you gave me a call last time or an email, and I was quite pleased to have those come in as well. And hopefully I was able to help some of you answer some questions. And I make the same offer again, that if there are things that you have questions about that we don't have a chance to get to, or there's not sufficient detail to be able to respond back and forth in a chat, I'm more than happy to respond privately as well. And in terms of today, if you want to offer this up in the chat or just in an email or just a comment, we've been working this as interactively as we can using a virtual system. I've been reading through the chat questions and I don't think I've missed any, and responding to them all, even if I can't provide fulsome answers. And I wish I could, but just some of them are so specific to you that I just, without any sense of authority or understanding or expertise, don't feel comfortable saying things that I can't prove. So what worked for you? What needs to change? For next time, what would bring the most value to you? So here's my contact information, ian@strategicsteps.ca, and my phone number. And with that, we've kind of reached the end of what I would talk about today. But if you had questions that you wanted to bring up still, I am absolutely happy to respond to them as we go. But to that end, I have no more questions in the chat. And if anybody has anything they want to provide to me, I'm more than happy to respond to you that way. But otherwise, you guys have a good evening, and we'll see you again next week, I think, for those of you who are going to be participating next week on the panel on communication and engagement. And I will just leave it at that and say thank you very much for your participation. And thank you too to the City of Stratford for seeing this as something that's important enough to spend your time and resources on. So thank you, everybody. Have a great night. Okay, Ken says, if anybody's still here, I'm really interested in hearing ways to improve citizen engagement and how the public can communicate better to City Council and vice versa. Gold standard in regard. We will, so I'm not going to answer that tonight because that will spoil the fun for next time. There is, however, to the best of my knowledge, no gold standard in that. It's, we talked about wise practice once, best practice modified for local circumstance, and that's one of these cases as well. I think I cut somebody off who was about to say something.
Ian.
Yes.
I have one more question.
Who is this?
It's David Neese.
Oh, hi, David. Sure.
I'm asking this because it came up as a comment in the first session that you held. What does it tell you when a council is referring items back again and again and again to staff?
I made a reference earlier. Without knowing the specifics, I'll just give some general answers.
No, I don't. I can't. I
No,
can't give you a specific example. I just know that there's a general feeling that there's a lot of that goes on, and compared to other municipalities, is it common, or is it symptomatic of a problem?
So it's common in complex issues, complex long-term issues, for referrals to be made back and forth a few times. It's not common. Sometimes it can be a delay tactic, but I typically haven't seen it as a delay tactic. I'm a bit of a Pollyanna maybe in all of this as well. I think people, whether they're elected or whether they're appointed, are coming to do the best job they can with the resources that they have, with the mental resources and the family support that they've got. One way they do, but one of the things can be delayed though, is by constantly asking for more and more and more information. And these complex topics, I don't know which one specifically is, you're never going to have all the information. So there becomes a point of political reality where council members have to publicly state, based on what I know, or based on what I've heard, this is the decision I'm going to make. And there's some, they use some political capital in that because there's risk. Because there may come something 2 weeks from now or 2 years from now that says, you guys made the wrong choice. But we did what we could with what we had.
Yeah. Yeah. It really is a question of how much information is required before people feel comfortable to make the decisions. And I'm sure that the reason I raise this, and it's good in a way that there aren't that many people here, is that the general impression I had before I moved to Stratford 5 years ago, I was living in another municipality that was close by, and we used to get the news about Stratford's decision making, and the impression I had was that there was a tremendous amount of referral going back to admin from council, and it seemed to me that it wasn't so much a delaying strategy as it was just a hesitancy to make decisions in the absence of complete and full information, a kind of hesitancy about being bold, if you know what I'm saying.
So one of the things I often talk to councils about, particularly during orientations early on, is the two-sided coin of risk and innovation. If you want to innovate in your community, you're going to have to take some risks. Now, don't be stupid about it. Don't blow the bank on a casino bet. But an example of this I see is incubators, business incubators, if you like. That maybe a municipality says, we are so reliant on one industry right now, or we don't have enough industry at all, that let's try working with entrepreneurs to develop new businesses in town. And there's one community I work with from time to time that likes to call itself a sandbox community. So it's got an incubator program, and it says, come here, try your thing. If it works, scale it up here. If it doesn't, we took a risk, we tried our best. And people seem to be okay with that because it's not stupid investment. People realize, citizens realize why they're doing what they're doing. It's not an interference in private industry because private industry wasn't doing it. And they're thinking this is a good way to increase our commercial and industrial tax base, to remove some of the reliance on purely residential taxes.
Yeah, I would agree with what David's bringing up because I observe council very regularly. And I've been in many other cities as well, and I'm a political junkie. I follow councils, and there is a real, it's almost like an illness here that a lot of the referrals back to staff are because they are hot button issues, and council doesn't want to take a side because it could cost votes and that kind of stuff. So there's this constant referral back to, we need more information. Sometimes it gets right down into the weeds. And they never actually do it. A good example of one that just happened on Monday is they have a development on Ontario Street that a lot of the community and the citizens there are fighting against, and they've engaged consultants and all kinds of things. And there was a very long meeting, which ended up in a very close vote of 6-5, saying, well, let's refer it back to staff. And the danger in this is that this is one of those things where there's a development and it's gone on over 120 days, which means the developer is now in a position to say, I'm going to bypass city council, go to the local tribunal, the provincial tribunal, and they'll make the decision. And I just have the feeling that I've seen it so many times where there's a hesitancy to take sides amongst primarily 99.9% of city council. And that's because we have a lot of old guard people here.
Okay.
And I don't know how you fix that, because that's a cultural thing. That's almost like, you know, we want to keep things the way they are. So we'll take no steps. And in my experience, this is the least innovative city I've ever lived in. So,
Okay.
so
So I will take that at face
And-
value because
Yeah.
I mean, you know it obviously better than I do. Sorry, David, go ahead.
Just want to thank you for your presentation and thank you for answering the questions. I have to go now, but generally, I bear up and you're doing a fine job.
Well, thanks.
Okay.
And thank you. I appreciate that. I do the
Take
best I
care.
can with what I've got. So I make the best
Yeah,
decisions.
Understood. Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
I
Good night,
agree.
David.
You're really helping us, not just the city councilors that are watching, but the public in general. So this is great that it's being archived. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Oh, you're welcome, Ken. Thank you very much for joining us and everybody else who joined as well.
Have a good day.
Good night.
Night.